You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the political editors of The Sun and The Guardian, Cole and Pippa Crerar. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, as Britain leads into the storm Isha, it says the UK's worst storm in a decade and will become the norm. That's after the Royal Meteorological Society predicts an increase over the next decade. The Guardian's front page covers the story on why doctors and healthcare staff are being urged not to report illegal abortions to police. The Financial Times carries claims from the head of the Electoral Commission that the Conservative Party have opened themselves up to allegations of pro-Tory bias in new voter ID laws. The Times reports that a new blood test can detect early signs of Alzheimer's, paving the way for routine screening for the disease. The Telegraph leads on the same story, calling the test a revolution for the over-50s. The Express also features the breakthrough and says experts believe this is one step closer to a cure. The Sun's leading with Camilla's advice to workaholic Charles to slow down. The Metro hears that a gastric balloon, which can be swallowed to aid weight loss, has been utilised for the first time on the NHS. Meanwhile, the Mirror's front page features a story about a young woman who's become the latest victim of a botched weight loss surgery in Turkey. The Star says a wildlife park is on high alert after 8 foul-mouthed parrots have joined its flock of African greys. What does that mean? A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And we're joined tonight by Cole and Pippa Crerar. Welcome to you both. Let's start with The Sun and these airstrikes breaking quite late, so not sure the other papers will be covering. But the airstrikes, the joint UK and US operation on the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Harry.
Yeah, so ever since the first strike on Houthi rebels in Yemen on the 11th of January, President Biden and Rishi Sunak and other Western allies who were sort of helping in a support role but not necessarily flying planes themselves have all said, look, they reserve the right to strike again if the first strike wasn't successful. The first strike wasn't really successful. In fact, did a bit of a PR job for the Houthis, if anything, because they came out straight away, said, ha-ha, we're still here, and the next day hit another ship with their sort of drones and cheaper missiles, and I suspect some of the things we're firing at Yemen tonight. First sign that something was up, I think, was really a quite unexpected call between President Biden and Rishi Sunak that Downing Street put out about 8 o'clock tonight, I think it was. Yeah, so something was up, and in that they said, look, we reserve the right to take further action. So it was clearly on the table, and as John Craig earlier was saying, yeah, they're at pains to stress these are precision strikes on specific targets. Lots of work goes into making sure civilians are not hit. Obviously, it's a tinderbox, and one mistake in any one of the growing sort of destabilising parts of the region could lead to a wider conflict. So the Western Alliance are at pains to stress that this is a sort of one-off, well, very surgical strike.
Pippa, multiple sites, Sanaa, the capital, also one of the sites that's been hit.
Yeah, and, you know, this is the 8th US-led strike, just the 2nd British one. So these have been going on in the meantime. And the Americans are claiming that they have destroyed 30% of the Houthis' stocks of missiles, which they're using to attack shipping and naval vessels along that Red Sea trade route. Now, I think the concern that people will have is that while that navigation route needs to remain open and, you know, it supplies Western Europe with all sorts of goods. There's oil tankers going through there. I mean, it's a major commercial shipping lane, and having to go around the Horn of Africa instead adds on weeks to journeys. So the supply chains, there's a supply chain impact there. But there is still a concern because actually, as Harry suggested, it appears these attacks appear to have made the Houthis more defiant. They're going down very well at home. They're garnering a lot of support in Yemen amongst their backers who feel that they have been oppressed, and see this as a sign of the strength of their armed presence, their armed force, but also they've been received well in some parts across the Middle East. They're Iran-backed, and it's not just a case of taking on the Houthis in Yemen. It also is. The government will say it's not a war by proxy with Iran, but nevertheless, Iran are involved in this.
But it's widely acknowledged that
they're pulling strings across the Middle East, and it's been presented as a sort of they've described it as the axis of resistance to Israel. Obviously, these attacks first happened after Israel's response to the October 7th atrocity. And the danger is, the fear is that it could escalate into something bigger. And that's something that both our government and the US government will be keeping a very close eye on. But it doesn't necessarily take much. As Harry suggests, it could be like one strike that ends up landing in the wrong place and killing civilians.
The other point to mention is that Saudis have been bombing Yemen for years and have had very little breakthrough to show and using pretty much exactly the same tactics and weapons. For the US to say they've taken out 30% of their capability, so far remains to be seen, because as long as those attacks are still coming and ships are finding it impossible to be insured along the route, and then before we even get onto the sort of knock-on supply chain issues that can have on inflation and prices and domestic, you've got is this actually going to work? And so it would suggest, because that initial strike was seen as a sort of one-off, and this was going to send a message, and now it's another. The US have been doing it, but now it's a second British strike. I think it will remain to be seen how long this works. But say tomorrow it wakes up and there's fresh drones and fresh missiles on Israel, US, UK-backed or linked ships, as the Houthis say they're targeting, then what do we do next? Do we crank it up a notch or what?
So do you both think that further strikes are likely?
I think that's what the language is there. Yeah. I think they reserve the right until it stops.
OK, let's move on to the eye and bring it back home. The storms that we've been experiencing, Isha first of all, which people are still recovering from. And no sooner that Isha has left us, Jocelyn is on the way in. Pippa.
Yes, I mean, everyone right across the country will have been battered by Storm Isha over the last couple of days. In fact, actually, us in London probably
got away with the worst,
got off with the lightest. Although, even so, I've seen a few bins and trampolines. And
the watering can was knocked across the street this morning, so it's seen a vast devastation in Blackheath.
However, my family on the west coast of Scotland have seen a slightly more dramatic side to it, with obviously huge impact on transport. There's always the knock-on risk of flooding with these sorts of storms. And the eye goes on the angle that these storms, both obviously Isha, which already had, and Storm Jocelyn, which is on its way tonight, leaving tens of thousands of people without power and several people dead, as well as obviously the impact on transport infrastructure. It suggests that these sorts of storms in a decade will become the norm, and it's the latest in. We've seen it before. We've seen it in the summer with extreme heat. We've seen it in the winter with extreme weather events as a result of climate change, which we're all going to have to start getting more and more used to. Up until this point, really, in the last few years, it's been these sorts of events have happened. We've had them sort of once in a decade storms, and now they seem to be happening in 2 days apart, in increasing regularity.
Yeah, bring back the cold is what I say.
But as they do become the norm, questions will turn to how we deal with them, and are we prepared?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, on the flooding point, I think if you look at, I remember sort of 2014, 15, floods were, these similar floods were really, really bad. Actually, the investment in flood defences has meant when it did come back this time, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it was 10 years ago. And it proves it takes investment. You've got to change how we deal with things. And if this is going to become the norm, then it's going to require money, and that's money that governments don't have. And it's whether it's, how many of these we have to sort of deal with before the proper investment in the railways are done, on the roads are done, to mean that actually we can keep the country moving in these situations if they are become more regular. Other countries have storms. They deal with them in extreme weather. They've had them for many years. They deal with them in their own way. There's got to be, at some point, a political crunch point where you need to start investing in this stuff. OK, Harry and Pippa, thank you very much for the moment. We're going to take a break. Coming up, Harry will tell us about his interview, yes, you, in the Sun with Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. Do stay with us.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Harry Cole and Pippa Crerar. We're having a look at the Sun, first of all, because we trail this. Your story, Harry, you spoke to Wes Streeting, and what did you learn?
So, Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting, who is quite an outspoken man at the best of times. He's good. He's very punchy. He doesn't hold back on what he thinks. He's doing a big speech tomorrow morning, where he's going to sort of put a bit of flesh on the bones of quite what the Labour Party were going to do in a situation with basically no money to spend, how they're going to fix the NHS. And he's putting reform at the heart of it. A war on waste as well. He's identified £10 billion worth of where he thinks there could be savings in the NHS. Frankly, we're going to be spending £190 billion across the UK on the NHS this year. So £10 billion worth of savings in context isn't very much. But I thought what the most interesting thing he said tomorrow to us is he talks about the last 4 general elections where Labour have just sort of taken it for granted that they're the, quote, party of the NHS, and all they need to do is say, you know, Tories, evil, boo, when actually patients and doctors and nurses are telling him that actually the problems in the NHS go far deeper than party politics. Reform is greatly needed. The Tories have spaffed all sorts of money whenever they've been asked, thrown money at the problem. The problems are still within the NHS. He's coming out with some comments which I think will annoy someone in his party, but he's not talking to the Labour Party, he's talking to Sun readers, and Sun readers are completely split on who should be the next leader of the country, who should run the country, and I say good on him.
Well, really, he should be talking to not to Sun readers or the Labour Party, but to people that work and use the NHS.
Which he said he's spoken to them, and this is what they're saying.
Well, I think there is generally an agreement that reform is needed. I think that people who work in the NHS will expect that to be informed reform and not reform just for its political sake. And of course, within the problem Streeting faces within his own party is that reform is a dirty word. Lots of people assume that reform, on the left of the party, I should say, assume that it means privatisation. And he's gone to great lengths repeatedly to say, no, it doesn't mean privatisation, that the private system will be used only when it comes to technological advances and development advancements of new technology, but that he's absolutely adamant about an NHS free at the point of use. And will defend that. So, but it is really interesting, the whole sort of advent of, how does the NHS develop and reform longer term? And if there is an argument, I'm not saying there is, but if there is an argument or a discussion or a debate to be had about whether some elements could be outsourced to the private sector, for example, Labour have already said that they'll use private hospitals to help clear the very, very long waiting lists that exist for NHS
Which is quite revolutionary for a Labour.
Well, no, Tony Blair did it. Tony Blair did it. So it's, they want to clear the waiting list, and they're thinking, what's the practical way, the best way we can do this quickly? Well, it's to bring in the private sector. But actually, in some ways, it's easier for Labour to have that discussion than it is for the Conservatives. For precisely the reason Harry says, if the Conservatives mention privatisation or even using the private sector at all in the NHS, people start shouting, hang on a sec.
Well, the loudest people that shouted it were the Labour Party, and I did sort of tackle him on that. I said,
battle.
Did he have Labour sort of slightly poison the debate around this? He didn't have a brilliant answer on that.
Very quickly, because we're running out of time, let's get to the Metro final story. Tell us about the parrots.
The Star as well.
Yes.
The Star. Who's a pretty potty-mouthed boy, then?
Pippa is an expert on this one.
I'm an expert on parrots, obviously.
Having read the story, you are now in charge.
There is a Lincolnshire Wildlife Park has got a group of troublesome parrots, who are grey parrots, who basically swear a lot, and they're a bit worried about it because kids and families come along and they're being told to F off. So they decided that the best way to do it is to reintroduce them to their flock of 100 other types of parrots in the hope that they drown them out. The problem might be is, of course, that parrots, what are they known for? Copying. So you let loose these 5 sweary parrots, and then
get corrupted
potentially
by
risk
dozens
dozens of parrots becoming potty-mouthed and swearing left, right and centre.
I have nothing to add to that.
Thank you. Pippa and Harry, thank you.